Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this kind introduction, Elias. And thank you to Sabrina and to the two teams for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. The last time I was here, this whole center was getting ready for a very important evaluation, and there were posters everywhere. And I had the chance to discover how impressive it is, all the work that is being done here. So I was really thrilled when you decided to invite me. So as Elias mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about this book, Seeing Others, that came out actually already a year and a half ago in September 23. But of course, much has happened. So I'll talk about what's happening in the US today and why the book, which was based on interviews with progressives and liberals, is still very relevant today, given what's happening in the public sphere. And I also then will talk a little bit about the current project that's very, very much still in the making. So the context in which I decided to write this book is one where there was an explosion of social movements on the left and the right of the political spectrum. So of course we know about Black Lives Matter and Me Too, and about the MAGA movement, which is often associated with working class people who have been downwardly mobile and are celebrating their national identity as American as a way to prop themselves up. But this is happening in Europe as well as the United States at the same time. And one of the main points of the book is that at both ends of the spectrum, groups that are making these recognition claims, these are all social movements that are focused on making recognition claims, are groups that feel that their dignity, their worth is not properly recognized, and they're mobilizing to rectify the wrong. So I felt very much that sociologists had important tools to understand what is happening now, or what was happening even during the first Trump presidency. If you remember, probably some of you are too young to remember, but you know, I have to remember sometimes that people in the room may be born in 2000. One of the first things Trump did in 2016 when he came to power was a travel ban against Muslim countries, followed very quickly with bans against, you know, trans people. So I felt we know the scenario. This is about stigmatization. It's about speaking to a space by engaging in symbolic boundary work, in reordering the status hierarchy in a way that is appealing to them. And I felt that the public is exposed to each of these decisions blow by blow, but they don't necessarily have a framework through which to understand what is happening there. And I have at Harvard these two colleagues, Danielle Ziblatt and Steve Levitsky, who had written the book How Democracy Dies, who drew on their profound expertise as people who had spent their lives studying authoritarianism in Latin America and Europe to help the general public understand in pretty simple terms what was happening. And I felt like we needed something like this. And there was an agent who was bothering me to try to do a trade book with her, and I felt, okay, I'll do it. So I decided to do it, which required learning to write a very different book. And the book came out simultaneously in the US and the UK, and I'm showing you both covers because I feel like the yellow cover, which is the Penguin, the international version, has the excellent subtitle, How to Redefine Worth in a Divided World, which says exactly what the book is about, which is about basically the white cover is the American one. And the story here is that you have the circle of people who feel that they have cultural membership, that they're worthy, that they matter. And then you have different groups that are more or less close to the center who want to get in. And the question of the book is to explain to the general reader, not to the social scientist, but to the general reader, what can we do as citizens to help make group boundaries more porous? And that's something I've been studying basically for 40 years. So of course there's a huge scholarly literature, but the book has like 70 pages of footnotes, but that's not what I hope the reader will look at. It's really about helping them as citizens figure out what are the ways in which this can be accomplished. And I think it was particularly important to do it at that time because you have authors such as Jonathan Haidt, the psychologist, who has been quite influential and who speaks about tribalism and about the notion that we're all wired, as in human nature wired, to like people like ourselves and dislike people who are not like ourselves, which presumes a kind of stable rigidity of group boundaries, to which I think is simply empirically false. So why do I know that? Because I was born just at the beginning. I'm French Canadian. I was born at the end of the 50s, at the time when this nationalist movement that really transformed the collective identity of French Canadians was booming, was exploding. And what we saw was, not only the mega production of intellectual and cultural work really expressing and challenging stereotypical understanding of what French Canadian culture was about, but also very explicitly contesting the stereotype and the stereotypical visions of French Canadian that English Canadians were so promoting. So it was really a tug of war in terms of defining who Québécois are, and it's still ongoing, but in many ways that battle has already been won at many levels when you look at the surveys, etc. There's a very famous book, I'll just mention two. One very important one was called Speak White. And Speak White is something that English Canadians would tell French Canadians to tell them speak English, And there's another book called White and Word of America. You see, I cannot even say it anymore. But, it became extremely, to say the French Canadian, low education, where many of them were exiling themselves in the US to work in the textile paper mill. And with the idea that it's an undereducated population. Anyway, all this to say, yes, these group boundaries change. They change all the time. There were parallels in the US with the Black is Beautiful movement, etc. So to go back to those two covers, I just want to mention as a joke that the it's very hard to publish with a commercial publisher like Simon & Schuster because they want to do crazy thing to sell the book, which is kind of shocking from the perspective of an academic. So they insisted that we put in the subtitle how it can heal a divided world. And it wanted that to be able to advertise the book in the self-help pages of Amazon. So, which is... I don't know many people bought that book for self-help, but I hope they didn't. They would have been very disappointed. So you can come in. So the goal was also not only to give the general reader the tools to understand what was happening, but it was also to give people hope, because I was very depressed. Many people were depressed. And if you read the literature in the social sciences on where, how people develop hope, it is done through the exposure of alternative narratives. So alternative narratives give you the cultural templates through which to imagine alternative futures. So that's why I decided to do this book that would be based on interviews with professional change agents, people whose job it is to create narratives. And one such person is Zachary Drucker, who is a trans person who was a advisor to the show Transparent. So when we interviewed both him and Joy Soloway, who was the creator of Transparent, they both said, well, we're doing this show to make trans people less abhorrent, more understandable, to humanize them, to describe them the way they want to be perceived. So the whole language that they were using to describe to us their objective emphasized both their desire to be more inclusive, but also to foster authenticity, to allow people to be what they want to be. And this really made me think much more about the place of inclusion and authenticity as alternative to other dominant scripts of self that I'm going to talk to you in a minute. And parallel to this, I love this slide with T-shirts. You have the other T-shirt, which became a poster that you could find on many lawns during the pandemic. And it's all about the celebration of ordinary universalism, what all human beings have in common. So love is a slogan that was extremely important during the same-sex marriage campaign to say, it doesn't matter who you love, Or no human is illegal was, of course, a protest against the persecution of undocumented immigrants. So in some ways, both, and ICU was also a way to celebrate an expression that was really embraced by Gen Zs to celebrate authenticity. So this slide says we did interviews with professional change agents, people who were very, very influential. So it's about top-down diffusion of cultural narrative, both production and diffusion, and scaling up these narratives. But it's also about interviews with ordinary people. We decided to interview Gen Zs about how they understand their life, and we looked at them as both cultural producers and cultural consumers. So bottom-up kind of part of the question. And the overall approach is influenced by a project that I co-led with Peter Hall, the political scientist, where for 19 years we co-directed the research project called Successful Societies, which was very much focused on looking at the conditions under which we can create successful societies. So we didn't like the term successful societies, but it's basically about creating societies that are better equipped to meet the challenges that come their way. So it can be about capabilities. It can be really about giving groups and societies the tool they need to become all they can be. And an example of that would be, think about same-sex marriage laws. These laws were not adopted to send a message to LGBTQI people about the fact that they're worthy, but it had that as an unintended consequence with the fact that it coincided with the decline in attempted suicide among LGBTQ youth. So that would be an example of the kinds of things this project focused on, which is really to look at institutions and cultural repertoires in terms of their impact in buttressing, in giving people scaffoldings that they need in order to deal with the challenges that come their way. And we very much thought of this as an alternative to the extra individual focus that is inherent to the notion of individual grit, promoted by Angela Duckworth and others, which was very much all about, individuals pulling themselves by their bootstraps. So you can see here a little bit of, if you want, promoting a strong sociological agenda in tension with some of the dominant tenets of psychology that had become slowly but surely really, really dominant in the public sphere, with the notion of we are warrior too, or, this notion of grit. So before going further, I want to, and I just in passing, when I'm saying institutions, often when we're looking at public policy, or at least it was the case when we were doing this work 20 years ago, people did not, like people study public policy, were rarely trained to think about what are the implications of the policies they passed in terms of recognition and stigmatization. Like food stamps were, put in place without people ever thinking. That's also a moment where I think economists were partly dominant in public policy and sociologists were pretty invisible. If you have food stamps, what does it mean? Like, poor people will go to buy groceries and would have to present this card showing publicly that they're poor. So that's an example of the blindness to the cultural messaging that comes with policy. So one of the takeaway of our book is, of course, that people who study policy or lawyers, for that matter, should be thought to very systematically think about the messaging about cultural membership that is inherent to their work. Okay, so now I'm going to give you a couple of definitions. So since you're all German, probably you're familiar with Axel Honneth's work. It doesn't require much explaining here, but it's basically this concept of recognition. You have it in Hegel. You have it used by a great many philosophers who in general don't study or never study cultural processes. So one of my contribution and that of my co-authors has been to take this pretty highfalutin theoretical language and try to turn it into how do you study this actually empirically. And that's what we did, some of the papers. But what's crucial here is that it's defined as a social act which means that this is something, recognition is something that is produced in interaction. I cannot just give it to myself. Recognition, it has to be produced in interaction with others. And it's about defining people positively. And the counterpart is this concept of stigma associated with Goffman, which is just the opposite. If you think about these two processes taking place all the time as we lead our life, as we interact with others, together as they interact, they lead to us to share definition of cultural membership about who's in and who's out, who's worthy and who's less worthy. And these definitions go hand in hand with shared views about our social obligation. What do we owe to others? Do we owe anything to able-bodied men who are not working? Do we owe anything to mothers of 4 children who are not working? There's a kind of gradational view of what's owed to whom based on characteristics and ability. So I have a paper titled "What is Missing? Cultural Processes in the Making of Inequality" that details how all of this is working, but I don't have time to explain it here. The main thing to remember is that behind this is a theory of social identity, which presumes that it is accomplished collectively in interaction as we interact with others. And, self-identification, like the example I gave you about French Canadian, self-identification is who self-Canadians said they were over time and how this changed, but the social identity results from that, but it also results from group categorization, what members of other groups tell you you are. And those two things are constantly jiving against each other, result in cultural membership. So it's really in some ways influenced by ethnomethodology as a paradigm. It's collective accomplishment that's ongoing as we lead our lives. Okay, so the case study itself, and I'm trying to go a little fast on this book because some of you, I know Sabrina and Elias and a few others, have already heard this presentation, so I don't want to bore you to death with this, but some of you have not, so therefore. So 185, why so many? Well, it was the pandemic. Everyone wanted to be interviewed because everyone was really bored at home. So we send a number of people a list saying this person had said yes and this person had said yes. So we were able to come up with a really, really nice list. And it includes 75 interviews with comedians and Hollywood creatives, and then 80 interviews with Gen Zs who were interviewed before the pandemic and during the summer of Black Lives Matter. And how did we go about this? Basically, we used network to tap people who were influential in the public sphere. So we defined, here we could have put also academia, the various organizational fields in Bourdieusian term that are very active in the production of scripts, messaging about what our society is and what it should be. So it includes, for instance, immigration, people working as militant in the field of immigration. So to give you a little bit of an idea, here are some of the people we interviewed for the Hollywood samples. So you have Michael Schur, who produced Park and Recreation, The Good Place, Black Mirror. You have the guy who produced The Handmaid's Tale. You have The Queer Eye. So a lot of really, Channing Dunhay was partly important because she was the person in charge of global programming at Netflix when I interviewed her. So she's the person who decided to diffuse Black Panther across Africa. And she's African American, and I was talking to her about her work, all this on Zoom. She said, well, for me it's really important because I wanted Black kids in Africa to have access to a narrative about Africans that was really a winning narrative, seeing, their people as winners, as people who are making the world, as opposed to repeating the usual stigma. So a lot of the people we interviewed had similar stories about what they were doing that typically had to do with inclusion and authenticity. And you have, like platform, that's really important. Jack Conte created Patreon, and he justified what he did in part by saying this allows musical creators to not be dependent on radio station. They can get direct access to their fans, and that allows for an explosion of creativity that makes room for all kinds of people who were shut out before. So anyway, I could go more in detail, but The book basically focuses on 3 different strategies for promoting a broadening of cultural membership. The first one is moving from a very unidimensional definition of worth that is very much anchored in neoliberalism, and how can we move toward a much more pluralistic understanding of who's worthy. The second is about ordinary universalism. I've talked about this a little bit. That's basically what Gen Zs are all about. It's often described in terms of woke culture. I'll explain why. And stigma reduction. How have groups that have been stigmatized in the past, who are no more stigmatized, how did this happen? And how can it happen more? So this is all the point about moving away from tribalism to think about how group boundaries can be made more flexible. So the first point about the plurality of scripts of self, we can start with, the script about meritocracy that, we know from, it's been demonstrated that the meritocracy as a script has gained enormous influence over the last several decades. I cite in the book a paper by Jonathan Meisch that shows this across all advanced industrial societies. But it's not, and meritocracy, of course, as sociologists, social scientists, we know it's largely a myth because people are not starting on an equal playing field. My kids have 2 parents who have PhDs. They're born on an escalator. Of course, they can screw up, but, the dices are loaded in their favor. But it comes with a package that is very much associated with neoliberalism. I can explain more. I know that here you have a project on scripts in Berlin that very much resonates with this. So one of the problems with this is that it really pushes a kind of bifurcation and the context where the university degree, the college diploma, is increasingly acting as a caste divide in the American society. Those who have the diploma have access to a great deal of upward mobility. Those who don't are really closed off and are condemned to live a life of, painful, much less consumption, repetitive work, all kinds of problems. And this caste system is really leading to a bifurcation in how people understand their self-worth. So the depictions that you see on, for instance, entertainment television are always glorifying people who are like us, college-educated professionals and managers. We are constantly depicted everywhere, not necessarily us, but people who have a similar attribute. I mean, even this show, what's it called? The Beef, this cook in Chicago who has a very successful restaurant, and then he becomes a great chef. It's not good enough to just have a working class joint. He has to become like a center of gastronomy. And you have, all the eye candy that comes with shows such as White Lotus. There's a colleague named Richard Butch who did a content analysis of decades of entertainment television, who shows that almost never ever do you have working class characters in entertainment television that are depicted as worthy of admiration. So you have the Bart Simpson, an idiot. All this has really fed the kind of, feeling in the working class that they are deeply stigmatized. I have colleagues who have studied, for instance, how the decline demographers like Kathy Eden, that this constant negative description, depiction of the working class has fed the concern among working class men that now they cannot get married anymore, they cannot be providers, therefore they're not going to church anymore, they're not joining clubs, they're just spending a lot of time in their basement on their computers. So there's been really an isolation that has come hand in hand with this feeling of being unworthy that has also, the literature by Anne Case and Angus Deaton on death by despair. All this is a kind of amalgam of conditions that have fed really very negative conditions for the working class at the same time as the extent to which there's intergroup contact has declined very significantly. If you look at incidents of interclass marriage, segregation, here I'm talking, of course, about the US, the extent to which middle-class kids get to know working-class kids in school, spatial segregation has increased extremely steeply. So it's become much more difficult for upper middle class kids and working class kids to know what the life of other groups are like. So we have a bifurcation all around. So in this context, the question of hope becomes even more important. So in our study, we looked at what are the alternative to this very neoliberal understanding of worth. One example of what we did is in these interviews with stand-up comics and Hollywood creatives, we coded all the things that they told us in these 75 interviews about the ways in which in their comedy and in their work, they're trying to contribute to recognition and destigmatization. So we created a typology in the paper that actually just came out in Work and Occupation. And one, to give you an example, one of the strategies that they engage in that we describe in this paper is what we call the Trojan horse, where essentially they say our job is not to force people to eat their vegetables, but to make them laugh. Therefore, we are like telling our jokes, but at the same time as we're telling our jokes, we're passing in little messages like making fun of the racist. And all this contributes to creating a much more inclusive society. So that's illustrative of the kind of narratives that these agents of change are actually engaging in as a way to challenge these meritocratic and unidimensional neoliberal scripts of self. Another example, if you Google on YouTube question bridge, you will see this video by Hank Willis Thomas, who is a black artist who interviewed 125 black men living across the country about what does it mean for them to be a black man. And in these interviews, he found that they said we have nothing in common but the fact that we all face microaggression all the time. So the goal of this was very much to question the stereotype of the black man as a source of problem, a source of trouble associated with poverty, etc., and to offer another narrative to really help people face the stereotype. And what is interesting in this example is that he was able to collaborate with an organization called the Campaign for Black Male Achievement. And this video was diffused over 2,000 community centers and high school across the country to really scale it up and to engage people in conversation about these stereotypes. So the point here, and that's the point that the book makes, is that there's these what I call recognition chains that connect the philanthropies that we interviewed a number of philanthropists for, or NGOs for the project, who are collaborating with cultural producers to scale up these narratives. And the point is that by scaling them up, they create an environment where these repertoires that are really much more inclusive become widely accessible. And you may remember that during Black Lives Matter, this became far more salient. At the time, you had the Mellon Foundation that decided to stop over-privileging institutions such as Harvard to create funding for community colleges and historically black schools. So you had a lot of changes like this that operated simultaneously to really transform the cultural environment in which we live. Now, of course, now we're in a context of, backlash, but I'll talk about this in a minute. We have, as scholars of social movements know, we always have reaction, counter-reaction. Well, that's where we are now. And the Ford Foundation was among the leaders in this collaboration between cultural producers and philanthropies. For instance, Darren Walker, who was the president of the Ford Foundation, which is one of the largest foundations in the US, decided, I'm going to focus on fight against inequality, and I'm going to do this through 4 pillars, and one of them is what I called connecting hearts and mind. And that was partly important because a lot of the foundations until then were mostly funding economists. So really realizing the changing potential of narratives to really attack stigma became really, really important. And the Gates Foundation did the same thing in trying to heighten awareness of a structural explanation of inequality instead of blaming the poor. So it was really systematic work that was being carried through a great many foundations. And just one example, Ford founded this film Roma that won an Oscar, that was showed on Netflix, which portrayed two domestic workers working for a middle-class family in Mexico City and really humanizing them. One of them is considering getting an abortion, and the camera is always fixated on their face, whereas normally, you know, maids, they're always in the background, blurred. This film just switched that around. And when I interviewed Agent Pooh, who was the leader of the National Alliance for Domestic Workers in the US, who collaborated in creating the film, she said that's exactly what they were trying to do. So it's really a lot of cultural work that was done specifically to destigmatize groups that had been stigmatized. And I could go on and on. You can think of human resource departments which focus on fostering a work-family friendly environment. It's also about recognizing care work as recognizing that workers are not only producers but also caregivers. So this kind of work happens at many, many levels, even in mainstream, corporations. So moving us away from purely productivist paradigm. Okay, so that's one contribution, and now I'm going to go faster. Then I look at how stigma, groups that have been historically stigmatized, such as people like who have HIV/AIDS, how they saw their stigma decline significantly from 1980s when the AIDS crisis started to today, where when it started, I remember because I was in Palo Alto at the time in 1983, everyone was really freaking out about HIV/AIDS. People thought like you could basically get it by being in the same room as someone who had it, and it was a disease that was highly moralized. There was a lot of, language about this is a disease of gay men who spend too much time having sex with random people in public bathrooms. And then, that is not a deeply stigmatized disease anymore. Whereas, people with obesity were stigmatized 40 years ago and still are. So what we did in this paper is that we used secondary sources to trace the process by which this stigma was challenged. And what we found is that the knowledge producers, who are legal experts, medical experts, social scientists, journalists, played a key role in drawing on cultural resources that were part of the environment to engage in destigmatizing action that aimed to remove moral blame. So a lot of it is really, for instance, medical doctors were very important with the case of HIV/AIDS in saying anyone can get AIDS. It's not, something that is partly, a question of morality or sexuality, whereas this did not happen for people who are obese. They were framed, first, here we're drawing on the book by Abigail Sagi, What's Wrong with Fat, which shows how the medical profession really objected to the social movement called Healthy at Any Weight, which was trying to argue that the BMI was really a bad way of measuring health. Well, that, of course, it had lost credit since she wrote this book, but it was very much viewed like people who are obese are lazy, they don't take care of themselves, they lack self-actualization, etc. So in some ways, it's a condition that has remained very stigmatized. But the takeaway of this part of the book is really that stigma can be transformed, and they're really being challenged all the time. And then the part of the book, there's a chapter that's specifically on Gen Zs. And the point here, I didn't do these interviews myself. I had graduate students do them because Gen Zs have problem with boomers. They think we really screwed up. So I couldn't do these interviews myself. But what we learned from these interviews is that really in some ways the worldview that they promote is one where they is very much focused on ordinary universalism. And because they believe the American dream is not accessible to them, they really very eagerly hold on to an alternative, which is, partly the therapeutic ethos, this notion of work-life balance, that their mental health matters, which is frankly something that was very abstract for people of my generation. We didn't know that we had something called mental health. And they embrace ordinary universalism. For instance, the idea that if they are queer, they want this to be acknowledged. So things like non-binary restroom or non-binary pronoun become extremely important, and they might get upset if people don't acknowledge that these things are very important for them. So this part of the book, I think, really helps us understand how they're pulling these things together. At the same time, they're American kids, so they're very agentic. They believe it's normal to take your life in your hands, and they believe they need to make money, but they really, all this is tempered by other values on which they put a lot of emphasis. So at the end of the day, the books, and the penultimate chapter of the book pulls all of this together to say all this cultural production that is happening all the time is resulting in a kind of trickle down, 1,000 point of lights of alternative narratives that are creating the society that we live in today. Now the hopeful, and this is another poster that you could find on many people's lawns, which was also created after the ban against travel to Muslim countries, from Muslim countries, which is really a proclamation, again, of ordinary universalism, to say you belong even if Trump tells you you don't. So at the end of the day, where is the hope? Everything that I've described, you have to remember, Trump was, in fact, he didn't get the majority of the votes, and these cultural production are still going on. So I know that many people, and I'm certainly one of them, think that the resistance to Trump has been very slow coming because his attack on everything that I've just described, this world that emphasizes inclusion, has been extremely intense. And I think he really has in some ways shocked people to some extent that it took a while for people to get organized. And of course, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, was really in shambles trying to understand what had happened. So one piece of evidence that this is happening, we looked, you see, this is a list of some of his, of some of what he's done since coming to power. So he attacked progressive agents of change across a number of fields, like he's constantly attacking the kind of cultural producers who I studied in this book. Now he wants to cancel public radio. He wants museums, the big American museums, to only celebrate American culture, to not have any more history of slavery in the museum. So it's really an attack to redefine the American public sphere in a very, very radical way. So, and some of and he's canceled funding to the Centers for the Humanities, which play a crucial role not only in DC, but across all of the states. You have state humanities council that play a crucial role in, maintaining all kinds of resources that are essential, including, and this article is very much about the red state, where, if you don't have these organizations doing things, there's basically very little alternative narrative about anything that will be present in these environment. But this paper, which came out quite recently, really shows how the same kind of recognition chains are being put in place now. And during April, there was 2 days with mega demonstration all over the country. So I personally feel like, the winds are really turning, and it's turning, of course, in part because universities such as my own are now taking the lead in resistance. So I'm not saying that the battle is over, far from it, but there's a lot of things that are being put in place now. So we can talk more about the situation in the US. I'm sure that our 2 discussants will have a lot of comments and questions about this. Okay, so now I'm going to briefly change gears because I've already talked for a while. Talk to you about this new project. So after the book was published, I decided that I wanted to extend this work beyond the US. Seeing Others is about the US. It has a lot of examples that are international, in part because I'm a comparative. I've always worked in a comparative context. But now I decided to more specifically study how groups can claim recognition and how do they do it. So I defined a number of paired case studies that would allow me to do this, and I decided to do this in collaboration with colleagues in different settings. So the first comparison is about invisible, what I call the invisible working class. So those are young workers 18 to 30 who don't have a college degree. So if you want, it's the counterpart of seeing others, because the progressive Gen Zs who we interviewed, we didn't choose progressive Gen Zs to study it for seeing others. They just happen to be, progressive and liberal. But we know that the non-college educated Gen Zs are a group that are very much neglected. So we decided to study them and decided to start doing this 3 years ago, even before Trump was elected. And we decided to compare, so I'll just describe this quickly and then I'll explain to you. Then we decided to look at indigenous people. Here we want to know how they seek recognition or don't seek recognition through politics. Are they staying away from politics? Do they think politics will give them recognition or not? For indigenous people, we were concerned with cases of environmental justice and whether or not they seek recognition through engaging in the defense of the environment or through work. And then there's a number of what I call impossible cases where, for instance, LGBTQI people in Senegal, in Uganda, race in France, all cases where it's very difficult for groups to seek recognition in specific national context. So the case of the two Manchesters, you have Manchester, New Hampshire there, which is an hour north of Boston. And you can see the town looks a little bit like this. It's very similar to Manchester, UK. So we decided to compare the two Manchesters because both places are at the center of the Industrial Revolution in their respective countries. They have been the center of very important working class movements. So we thought, okay, let's, sample in a dependent variable if you want, choose places where it's more likely that workers will be more progressive given this history. And we've completed 65 interviews in Manchester, New Hampshire, and the interviews in Manchester, UK are still ongoing. And we had a lot of questions. So for instance, if these places have a strong place identity, does it mean that they're more likely to have a very agentic relationship with politics, where they would view politics as a place where they can, work toward constructing the kind of life they want or not? Well, to give you very quick summary, what we find in Manchester, New Hampshire is you ask them, are you part of a union? They say, I don't know what's a union. How would you define yourself in social class? They respond, what's a social class? And they have no knowledge whatsoever of the history of Manchester, New Hampshire. So it's a working class that's extremely mobile. So there's class identity and place identity are totally disconnected. And our colleagues in Manchester, UK are finding the same thing, not in terms of class consciousness, but in terms of their connection with place identity. And I'll tell you in a minute. We have a paper looking at the results in Manchester, New Hampshire, but I'll wait a second to give you the details. So what we know is that when we do these interviews in Manchester, New Hampshire, and you ask them what words do you associate with politics, it's all negative. It's drama, it's trauma, I want to stay away from it. So this is, Elias has a paper on this, it's very much, and there's other papers saying something very similar. They are engaging in moral boundaries toward the upper half at the same time as, so in some ways it is recognition seeking. They're trying to stay away from it because they feel that this is something that's really harming them and not giving them voice. And then, so some of the early findings are really that they draw very strong boundaries toward people below. They want to stay away from renters, people on welfare, drug addicts, but they identify with people above. They really admire the rich, for instance, Trump, and they view the embrace of the American dream as a form of gaining symbolic citizenship. It's very hard in the American context for workers to not say, yes, that's what I want, because it is so dominant. And yeah, that's what I said earlier, no connection between place identity and class identity. So in our paper, we look at how they understand, no, I'm not going to talk about this, sorry. basically, the key argument of the paper is that we distinguish between those who are seeking recognition through politics by staying away from it, because it's a way to see this is an alienating world from me, I'm not going to invest in it. Then we argue that some are seeking recognition through inclusion. They are very small number of our respondents are supporting the Democratic Party, and they say we do so because they tie it to their personal identity as people of color or as LGBTQI, saying, you know, this is who I am as a person, and only through the kind of values that the Democratic Party is promoting do I find my place in the world. The Trump supporters, who were the majority of our respondents, engage in recognition too, because they think that Trump is giving them recognition, because he's giving them voice. And but they do this through exclusion. They say that what we need to do is keep all the resources for ourselves. So therefore, we're not going to support Gaza, we're not going to support Ukraine, we're not going to support immigrants, we want to keep all our resources ourselves. But what Trump gives them, and we co-authored a paper on this based on the electoral speeches that he gave in 2016, where we show how he's constantly propping up workers by saying, I'm there for you, I understand that you're the backbone of American society, and you're not doing well, and it's the fault of globalization, and it's the fault of immigrants. So, you know, this positioning himself as the person who understands them and will defend their interest. So, so this gives you a little bit of an idea of where this book is going, this part of the book at least is going. And it's really, you know, looking at I think we're going to move toward looking at the two groups of workers in terms of the degree of groupness. This would be more for a scientific paper than for the book. I'm not sure exactly what the book is going to look like. I think it might be written as a travelogue, so I'm still deciding that. Then the second comparative case study, which I'm very interested in, is, you know, I grew up next to Ottawa, but on the Quebec side, you have the black circle there. So this is the watershed of the Ottawa River, also called in Algonquin the Kishizibi River, and it's larger than Europe, but you've never heard of it. It's just an enormous area of Quebec. And you have in it several Algonquin First Nations that live there, like there were the Pikwanagan, no, the Kitigan Zibi is literally 2 hours north of where I grew up, but no one knew anything about them. And it was very much, you know, infinite forest. No one knew what was happening there. But since when I was growing up, the key divide was linguistic and religious, a big opposition between French and English Canadians. Now that divide has really attenuated, and one of the main divide. Now we discover, oh, we have black people in Canada. Oh, we have Native Americans. So now the, you know, the tension, the settler colonialist tension is much stronger, and we've discovered that these group exists. So I've been through enormous amount of work, extremely difficult work, being able to gain access to two of the First Nations, the Kitigan Zipi, Pikwanagan, which is the one that's just next to Ottawa, and the Kebewek, the one that's at the top, closer to Ontario. And what we're doing is interviewing them on how they think about the place of protecting the environment and gaining work. So the reason we're doing this is that there's a nuclear waste disposal plant being built just next to the Ottawa River, and that's 2 hours north of Ottawa, the capital of the country. And of course, this can easily leak, so it has potential for really damaging the environment. And it is located just next to a sacred site, L'Oiseau Rock, which is very close to, if I go back here, so basically it is located here. So it is just next to Pikwanagan, and the other group is there, Kebewek. So Pikwanagan is the First Nation that has agreed to this. And when I talk to them, they say the reason we agreed is we need the jobs. You know, but at the same time, they're also indigenous people. They very much think that their role is to protect the environment. And they say, we've agreed at the condition that we can monitor the situation. Whereas Kebewek, they are the ones who are leading the opposition. So we're in the process of doing these interviews. It's too early to tell you what's happening there, but that's the question. And the paired comparison there is with the Northern Mariana Island, which are located 1,000 miles south of Japan. And I have a graduate student who is a Chamorro from the Northern Mariana Island, and I'm doing this project with her. And she's in the process of doing interviews there and also in Guam, which is just next to it. But what's interesting is that these islands are basically, they're part of the Commonwealth. They're called the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Island, which means that the American government can do whatever they want with them. So they're building I have misplaced some things here. Yeah, so they're very present. There's these big ships that were just in front of my hotel, which within 72 hours can build a military base on the island. So the idea is, Guam is where there's a big military base there, and if there's an attack between North Korea, China, and the US, that's where the attack is going to take off. So they want to build a diverted military airfield there to be able to really strengthen their ability to attack. And this is an important site historically because that's where the planes that brought the atomic bomb to Hiroshima and Nagasaki took off. So they have these old airfields that they are now in the process of refurbishing. And all this construction for military purposes is really transforming the environment. So the same kind of question that we find in the Kishizibi region, you find here. And what we found so far, we have like 30 interviews conducted there, is they don't give a damn. You know, they are totally embracing the American dream. They have, unlike many other islands from the Micronesia, they have American citizenship, so it's a world of consumption where their indigenous identity is basically being subordinated to the American dream, which is, I think, very contrasted to what we have found so far in our interviews with First Nations in Canada. So we come up with a number of hypotheses about, low level of groupedness among the Chamorros in Saipan compared to the Canadian context. So I'm just mentioning all this to give you an idea of the kind of analysis that is going to come out with, hypotheses having to do with how they think about their collective identity and what kind of boundaries they draw when they're thinking of their commitment to these different forms of recognition. So I think I've talked a lot, and maybe I'll just stop here. And I'm not going to offer you a conclusion. I'll simply wait to hear. But this is just to give you a general idea of what this new project is trying to attempt. It is still very much in the making. I'm on leave this year in Europe, and I'm doing all this work at the same time as I'm giving talks around. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabrina and Elias, for co-organizing this together, and for the gracious introduction, Sabrina. It's been a pleasure to listen to your summary of your book, but also your new projects. You're always full of new ideas, critical, new, and always inspiring ideas. The idea of this whole recognition and how boundaries are drawn and this collective groupness, of course, affected my research for a long time, and that's how we met, actually. And also I had the chance to be in Michèle's research cluster when I was at Harvard. So it's keeping on making me think about things. What I liked about this recent book, and very different from the books that you have written before, is this more focus on recognition in a global scale. Of course, that's pretty novel in compared to the previous books. But also the language that you're using in the book is much more accessible than your previous books. And it's more open to global audiences, I find. So I really appreciated how you picked up on the self-narratives about what kind of people we should be. one thing that resonated with me while I was reading your book, by the way, the book is here if you would like to take a look at it. So one thing that resonated with me is in the book that we wrote with Anna Kortawek, the headscarf debates, we looked at how different European countries construct national identity through media, through legal, through policy discourses. And so what's different from what you have been telling today, instead of asking for recognition, the European countries are actually constructed their self-identity by saying that that's not what we don't want to be. So in that sense, now I'll give you an empirical example which is going to be more clear. For example, in France or in Germany, that identity, the French identity or the German identity or the Dutch identity for that matter, is constructed vis-a-vis Muslim identity that we don't want to be. We don't want to be violent towards our women, we don't want to be criminals, and that's how we construct our European identities. So a European identity in that sense and European belonging is very much based on how we construct the other Muslim versus our own European identity, which is more secular, which is not, which is respectful to gender equality, respectful to women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and so on. So this the European belonging in that sense is constructing itself through this othering process. So I am wondering in one way or another if in your European sabbatical you just mentioned, whether you are, what kind of European belonging recognition patterns are you observing? This is one of my questions that I would like to ask you today. So I have done quite a bit of research about especially like Arab clans, and especially that's something that's, of course, like all of us at the Humboldt-University right now, as you might know that our institute was occupied by a pro-Palestinian group, and this has been quite present in our everyday lives in the institute. And I am always thinking, you know, what kind of recognition gap is there that we are not recognizing the occupiers, and if as university professors, if there is something that we need to do and we are lacking of doing in, I'm just questioning myself what we have done wrong as university professors that our students actually occupied our institute building. So, and another recognition problem is perhaps the new anti-Semitism resolution that passed the Bundestag recently, and what kind of signals that's sending it to the Palestinian immigrants and Palestinian communities in Germany today, that that we can use this recognition gap and like criminalizing the Palestinian identity or taking away the democratic right to protest, and generally creating an imported anti-Semitism concept in Germany that's very present in our everyday life at the moment. And that's also, again, something that constructs the European identity or the German identity via the Palestinian via the othering of the Palestinian. So another question that I would like to ask is, so I prepared 3 questions. So this is the first one, and the other one is Trump against Harvard. And Trump against Harvard is creating an anti-intellectual identity, like, you know, Trump, who is like speaking with like 50 words in his everyday life, is you know, creating an American identity against Harvard, which is like the global intellectuals, you know. And what kind of recognition gap this is providing for the American society? On the one hand, in your talk today, you said about, you know, the working class who has been perhaps neglected or not being recognized or something. Is it the working class strikes back? Or what's going on here, if you can decipher it for us for a little bit, I will appreciate that. A final question, because gender scholar is always a gender scholar. While I was reading the book, and I always wanted to ask you this question, so I'm glad that I'm having this chance today. As you know, there was a Financial Times article on research. I forgot the name of the researcher now, but men are getting more conservative and women are getting more liberal. So this really affected me, thinking that, why are men are being more conservative? At the same time, globally, the suicide rates among young men are soaring. So I'm always thinking, and also when I was reading your book, I was thinking, what did feminism do to men in order to make them more conservative, in order to affect their mental health? And I was wondering if you could also, from your findings, if there would be a possibility to read feminism from this kind of a perspective, that has feminism reflexively done something that we forgot about our male counterparts? So these will be my questions.
What is happening now in Europe, and how can we describe this situation in terms of recognition gap? So I think you captured it very well, summarizing your own findings about how European identity has been crystallized in large part in opposition to Muslim identity over the last few decades. That's totally in line with everything I know. I would say what is missing in this story, which I've become very fascinated with. I spent September to the end of January in Amsterdam, and now I'm at the University of Manchester for 3 months. And in the middle, I spent 1 month in Hong Kong and 10 days in Abu Dhabi. And each of these have been very interesting experience in terms of thinking about American society. And I know you're going to all think that I'm being a romantic about Europe, but what I see in the US and what I know is that, yes, there's this very profound loneliness epidemic and the death by despair. Things are pretty ugly. And what I see when I go back to the US is standards of civic interaction are going down the toilet. Like people are not very nice to each other. Like literally for this whole year, I know it exists because I lived in Paris for 4 years. I know people can be extremely rude to each other. But I think the current standard in the US are really, really low, in part because I think Trump is emulating, is showing everyone how to treat others without any respect. What I saw, you will think I'm Pollyannish, but in Amsterdam, the fact that people go out to the pub, okay, they drink too much, fine. In the UK as well, but they're socializing, with their coworkers. Like people don't socialize with coworkers in the US, Like I know it's easy to look at the society in which you live by what it's lacking. And my friends in Amsterdam describe their society as small society of small-minded people. Of course, they can be very critical of their own country, but I can see the many ways in which in both countries the social fabric is still lively and is still to some extent healthy. And what I said earlier about the working class not joining any associations anymore, by any indicator, civic associations are plummeting in the US. So I think the problems that we have are way worse than most people think it is. And then, not to celebrate Abu Dhabi too much, but like the contrast with the extremely high level of homelessness across all American society, you are there and you really feel in society that's deeply decadent. It's really a society that is facing so many enormous challenge, and that's the context in which Trump is able to have the appeal that he has. So I think this broader question we could ask is the effect of scarcity on the kind of boundary work that is being conducted. And you mentioned the place of anti-Semitism and the pro-Palestinian, tension in the European context. We have the same, except that in our context, I think most people know that Trump is just using, the defense of the attack against anti-Semitism as an excuse to attack the very institutions to which he has never had access, which are basically all the cultural and the academic industries, and also people in New York, like everyone, every institution that has ever stigmatized him, he's going after them with a vengeance. And one of the best analysis that I read of this is this Russian journalist, Masagisan, who wrote a wonderful piece about you don't negotiate with the mafia boss, you know, and she writes that based on her experience with Putin. All he's going to do, it's like in Godfather, you know, he's just going to put another horse head on your bed, you know. Like, there's no negotiating at all with him, because this is his logic of, you know, servitude and asking people for loyalty. So, where am I going with this? So that's a dimension that I think is playing. I know that in Germany now you have very strict rules about pro-Palestinian attitudes. I think they are way more drastic and authoritarian, frankly, than what we have in the US now. In the US, I think we have what Trump is doing now, but no one takes it seriously. The number, even among young Jewish people, most of them, I don't know any young Jewish people are pro-Zionist are extremely rare. So there's a huge generational divide between, you know, the 70-year-old men typically who think that it's their mission to defend Netanyahu or defend Israel, and younger people. So I think there's a huge divide among Jewish people in the U.S. So I think that, but in here you have a huge urban-rural, and I've written an article actually on this. The rural-urban gap is really profound in Europe. So that's a brief answer to that. And then the second one is, Harvard against Trump. I've kind of already talked about this. I would add to this my answer to the third question, what's happening with men? Well, I think one of the things that has happened that is real, if you look at the college-age population of young men versus young women, I read recently that only 38% of men are in college versus 51% of women. So I think that the the attacks against DEI that Trump is engaging with such fervor is really in some ways catering to these young men who feel very much that they have been deeply penalized on the labor market by DEI. And, you know, maybe to some extent they have been, you know. So I think it's this loss of status that they experience in the labor market that is correlated with a very high level of suicide. I don't know if it's, I mean, I imagine a analytical explanation was certainly connected to emasculation, but I don't know exactly how to account for it. I think there's a real sense among young men that they have lost something very, very deep. And it's interesting because I have twins who are 24, a boy and a girl, and it's very interesting to talk with them about these things. And the girl is as woke as could be, whereas the boy is not. So, well, my son is not conservative, but he's not woke. So these are elements of response. I think there's so much more that I could say.
Yeah, I would also like to thank you very much for your very interesting book, which I read through the eyes of a political scientist. And when I read about your concept of recognition and this problem that it sometimes has to do with what you also described, another interesting term, the diploma divide. So this is, of course, an issue that we also discuss in political science when it comes to voting behavior or when it comes to political representation by those in power. And maybe you followed that we are going to have a new government in Germany, and when the cabinet formation talks were going on, so we just learned today about the full range of new ministers, there was, of course, also a discussion about representation, so regions, gender, professions is indeed also a huge problem because the majority of MPs in Germany, as in many other countries, do have a diploma and sometimes even have a diploma in law, or so that other professions are hardly represented. And then we have this concept in political science, but I'm sure you're also familiar with it, with the descriptive representation. So my question to you would be how it relates to the issue of recognition. Would you say that a certain kind of representation in the political sphere could be a precondition for having more recognition of vulnerable groups or groups that feel neglected in the political discussion today. And my second question relates a bit to issues that you have also mentioned in your response right now and during your talk, because we, on the one side, of course, have those people that ask for more recognition on the more progressive side of the political spectrum. At the same time, those that you also talked about, and we also have a lot in Germany as well and elsewhere in Europe, people on the more right-wing side of the political spectrum also talking about recognition and being victims of a certain public discourse that neglects their perspectives and so on. So what would you argue in that respect? So how diverse is the concept of recognition? What to do with recognizing political ideas that are maybe opposite to what you presented to us from your interviews? We may also have a new discussion about banning political parties. Maybe you heard about the assessment that the AfD is now officially considered or described as a right-wing extremist party. So what to do with these kinds of political issues and also socio-demographic compositions of the society? Thank you.
So your first question was about are these dimension of political representation a precondition or a precursor to broadening the recognition to a group as a whole? I think of this in a kind of multi-causal way. It's more like compounded messaging that is occurring through various channel. This that in some ways should not be entirely out of whack. Otherwise, it might be dismissed as wokeness. So I remember when Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister of Canada, his cabinet was extremely diverse. He had Sikhs, he had the, First Nation women, and he, I think because Canadian identity is largely defined in opposition to American identity through multiculturalism. The main thing that differentiates, that Canadians think differentiates American identity from Canadian identity is that we think of ourselves as vastly superior because we're multicultural and we're less racist. That's actually the narrative about this. And so in this case, I think it worked to some extent, in part because of the predominance. A lot of people are very critical of Canadian multiculturalism because it's too light and it's not real. A lot of it is symbolic politics. So I think if we want to develop, a kind of political sociology of symbolic politics and the process by which groups that are underrepresented come to feel that they have voice, but that other group also believe they have the fair amount of voice. Now in Canada, there's huge backlash against First Nation people because some people feel they have way too much voice. And it's always the same people. What the racists say is it's always the same people who have a voice. And how about people like me? The white men feel very, very neglected, and they feel like this pecking order of who has the right to be viewed becomes extremely. So that's another underlying condition that is behind some of your questions, which is really about zero sum, right? And under what conditions do people come to feel like things are unfair? So, one of my pet theories about this is if you think as a parent that you have a child whose birthday it is and you give the child a present and the other kid gets really upset because he or she didn't get the present, and you say, well, your birthday is in 6 months and you're going to get your present then. But as a parent, you're able to create enough togetherness in the family to make them believe that this social contract is real. And the current context right now is that I think that's why I spoke earlier about the destruction of civil society in the American context, that this basic thrust that you will have your turn has become so frayed. that it's not working very much anymore. So but at the same time, dignity is a little bit, it's not like a piece of cake, in the sense that in principle, various groups can claim dignity at the same time and have it. But when it becomes measured or expressed through the distribution of resources, then it is zero-sum game. And that's really where the problem starts, I think. So the challenges then would be to move toward a more pluralistic distribution of resources, or have different principles kick in at different times so that people don't feel that it's always the same people who get overly compensated or overly visible. So maybe that touches on your question about the young men, you know, like how do you balance things out so that they don't feel like they've become totally ignored. So yeah, so the broader question then is really about how to move beyond the zero-sum understanding of trust.
Yeah, I think this is indeed really the crucial problem that also goes hand in hand with a lot of various mechanisms for empowerment, so that this often leads to what you described, that the other child then feels neglected and thinks, where's my present and why I don't have these benefits? I mean, as a politician, maybe one should then indeed try to distribute access to housing, to work, to education to a better extent, so that this access is really available for all the social groups in the country, or in entities such as the European Union or elsewhere.
I co-authored this paper on the rural-urban gap in Europe, and the main things they were mostly concerned with was subsidies to electric vehicles, since workers cannot, or rural people cannot afford it, and also access to the web, because the connectivity is so much worse. So, you know, these are things that you could think Brussels could easily have addressed. You know, those are not that hard. But if you think about the issue of young men, what do you think? Do you think there would be a way of addressing their concern through policy?
Yeah, when you were saying about, for example, think about Brandenburg, which is like half an hour from Berlin. 1 hour from Berlin. The bus system doesn't work. Like, everybody has to drive, and the gas is so expensive. So, or, you know, the doctors don't want to go to work at Mecklenburg-Vorpommern and things like that. There are like infrastructural problems still in the East that doesn't justify that they are voting for the AfD, but you enter Mecklenburg-Vorpommern and both sides of the villages are AfD posters. So, but there are infrastructural problems in East German, and, you know, yeah, it's difficult. I mean, it's maybe perhaps when I was reading the book, I was thinking if there's something called negative recognition, like you recognize. Yeah, it's difficult, but the main infrastructure has not been provided, or it's not sufficiently provided, like basic transportation, not only by the government or the state, but also by Western German people, like the doctors who don't want to work there, or people who do not want to. I mean, we had a house in a village at Mecklenburg-Vorpommern at some point, and the school was closed down, because there were no young kids anymore. People want to move away. I mean, it's the stigma that you're talking about, not only recognition, but it's also on top of it, there is a stigma about being in a village in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, that you're not a part of the globalization process. Yeah, it's tough.